So my understanding of the Battle of the Somme is it was, quite frankly, a bloody massacre. It was French and British troops going off at the top of the trenches and getting absolutely mowed down in tens upon thousands. The way it's told, story, in a cultural sense, is it is just an absolute massacre, and it's obviously something that never wants to be recreated, and it just shows how ignorant the people at the very top were. And the honest truth is the Battle of the Somme, the gains that were made were lost almost instantly, so it was a kind of a waste of time, but so many lives were lost in the process. Let's see what we get wrong about the Battle of the Somme.
In northern France. Thousands of men clambered out of their trenches and slowly began to advance towards German lines. Allied artillery had been pounding the German defences for a week, hoping to cut their barbed wire, destroy their dugouts, and provide a long-awaited breakthrough on the Western Front. But there was a problem. The Germans were dug in deep, and many of the British shells were either duds which failed to explode, or shrapnel shells which did little to no damage. Allied soldiers anticipated limited resistance.
To Willy with compliments. Is he rubbing? What is happening
were
here?
Either duds which failed to explode, or shrapnel shells.
Is he rubbing it? What the hell's happening there?
Anticipated limited resistance. But when the barrage lifted, German machine gunners emerged from their intact shelters and mowed down the oncoming British infantry in their thousands. That first day on the Battle of the Somme was the bloodiest day in British military history, with over 57,000 casualties. For many people, the story of the Somme ends there with unmitigated disaster. But the battle was by no means over. The British would go on to take another 360,000 casualties.
Oh my
God. The French over 200,000 and the Germans over 500,000 in a fight which would come to define the First World War.
Whoa, the Germans took more casualties than the British? Hang on, but the Germans were defending. So how does that make sense? Well, I suppose the combined allies of France and Britain and all the other colonial troops would make up a larger casualties than the Germans, right? The counter-offensive. Whoa, I never thought of that. If you think about it, you want to do a counter-offensive because at the end of the day, you want your best entrenchments back, don't you? You want your best bunkers back. I guess you have to put all the hard work into building the defenses up again, don't you? So you want to capture your defenses once again to hold a more secure front.
To understand the rest of the battle, we first need to understand why the battle was being fought in the first place. 1916 was set to be a big year for the Allies, with planned offensives on the Western, Eastern, Italian and Balkan fronts.
I've said it once and I'll say it a million times, guys. If you ever join the army, you do not want to be on the front line, okay? You want to try every possible role possible and not be on the front line. If I was in the army, man, I'd be one of those drone pilots, you know what I mean? But I want to be in the UK piloting one of those drones, be like, boo, boo, drop the rockets, you know what I mean? I'm not dying for no stupid wars, all right?
The Somme is supposed to be a French-led campaign. So the French army under Joffre have decided to fight on the Somme because at the Somme River, the British and French armies meet. Haig, however, wants really to fight in Flanders, but that doesn't cut any ice with the French, and the French are the senior partner here, so the French drive Allied strategy.
But when the Germans attacked at Verdun in February, the French army was sucked in to defend it, which changed the Allied plans.
But what happens is that switches the emphasis for the Battle of the Somme to be primarily a British-led offensive.
The Somme simply had to be fought, mainly to take pressure off the French, but also to start wearing down the German army as part of grand Allied strategy. This in part explains the disaster of the first day, but more importantly, it explains why fighting continued after that point, despite British unpreparedness. So what was the situation like after the first day? Well, these were the Allied objectives on that day, and this is where they actually got to after 2 weeks. North of the Roman road from Albert to Bapaume, it had been a disaster. South of the road, there had been some progress made, but the only places of real success were where the British could make use of French heavy guns. And in fact, below the River Somme, French troops had done brilliantly, exceeding their objectives and exposing the clear differences between themselves and the Green British Army. The next phase of the operation was focused south of the Roman road in an attempt to capitalise on previous half-successes. Repeated attempts to break through the German lines were made as the British took Bazentin, Longueval and eventually Delville Wood. When that sector started to get bogged down in late August, focus moved north of the road to the high ground around Thiepval and the heavily fortified Schwaben Redoubt. The fighting was brutal in places, and the Germans did not give any ground, often staying in their positions for weeks unable to be relieved. but throughout their time, the British Army was learning how to fight a modern war. One of the most famous instances of this experimentation came on the 15th of September, when tanks were used for the first time at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. If you want to find out more about those tanks, I've linked our video on that in the description.
Because it's a new weapon, a lot of the Germans absolutely freak out on the battlefield and abandon some of their positions. The big problem is only 36 tanks get to the start lines because mechanically they're very unreliable. And by the end of that day, there's really none left to use in subsequent days.
As the weather deteriorated into sleet and snow, the final part of the battle in October and November was an attempt to bite off a few more German positions. The village of Beaumont-Hamel, an objective on the first day of the battle, was finally taken in mid-November, bringing the fight to a close. The British Army had advanced a maximum of 7 miles, but they'd learned a lot in that time. And they'd taken an important chunk out of the German army.
I kind of want them to zoom back here to actually show more to represent on a large scale of Europe how much land was taken. Because I bet it represents like this much.
Look at the German casualties alongside Verdun. The Germans lose about 1.5 million men in 1916. And in fact, if we look at what the Germans do in 1917, firstly, they retreat to the Hindenburg Line because they just don't have the manpower left now, really, to hold the front line securely. The other thing they do, of course, is they go for unrestricted submarine warfare. The reason they risk doing that and potentially risk bringing America into the war is they cannot take another Somme battle. And both Hindenburg and Ludendorff say we are doing this to prevent more Somme fighting. So the Somme is the key thing in the German army.
So it did actually work. It pressured the Germans into changing their tactics. Wow, my understanding was it was a complete failure. Another random thought, you know, with bolt-action rifles in the First World War, of course ignoring some of the more experimental machine guns in the First World War, it'd be kind of less likely you'd get hitting civilians, would you? Because you've not got burst fire or fully automatic weapons carried by most personnel. The chance of hitting civvies just feels less to me. Because with a bolt-action rifle, you've kind of got one shot before you have to reload and bolt-action one new bullet into the rifle, right? So I feel like you have to spend more time looking at the target and assessing whether it's a civilian or if it's an enemy you're firing at. So I feel like with that in mind, you would less likely hit a civilian.
And the British people remained entirely behind the war effort. This was in part thanks to propaganda films like The Battle of the Somme, a feature-length documentary shot within the trenches.
And the Battle of the Somme film was released really within weeks of the battle starting. And it's seen by millions of people in Britain. And people flock to this because it's their first chance to see something of what it is like to be a soldier on the Western Front. And of course, that film, The Battle of the Somme, is one of the gems of the IWM collection.
Since then, though, the British public has started to have a different view of the events on the Somme. For many people, it's an example of the so-called lions led by donkeys, generals who didn't care about the deaths of their own men. Although the horrendous casualties on the first day of the Somme have never been surpassed, since the 1970s, academics have started to form a different view of the battle.
Okay, we don't have a successful decisive breakthrough as Haig was hoping, but unfortunately, if you want to defeat the main enemy in the main theatre of war, you have to wear down his ability to fight. That means both sides are going to take heavy casualties.
Reduce their manpower. Everyone's played Victoria or EU4 knows this, guys. Get that manpower to 0 on the other side and you win in.
We've just got this fixation with that first day and those 57,000 casualties, and we really need to look at the other 141 days of this battle, which will lead ultimately to British victory or Allied victory in 1918.
Wow, that's interesting. It puts a more positive spin on it than I initially thought. And that surprised me because the general British consensus, it was a massacre. The commanders didn't know what they were doing. It's interesting to hear that they had some success. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe for more React content. Ooh. You think this video was good? Well, this one is the final form. Click it.